Before we begin, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more soothing stories your way. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Lila adjusted her grip on the wicker basket as a cold wind swept through the bustling square, chilling her fingers through the thin fabric of her gloves. Her basket was filled with roses, red, white, and yellow, but their edges had begun to brown, and their stems drooped ever so slightly. It had been a slow morning, and the flowers were nearing the end of their life, just like the hopes she tried so hard to nurture. "Roses for sale! Only $5!" she called out, her voice small but persistent. She looked up at the faces passing by, men in suits with their heads buried in phones, women with designer bags who hurried along, avoiding her gaze. Once in a while, someone would glance at her, but most either sneered or ignored her entirely. She watched a young couple stroll past her. The woman admired a glossy bouquet in the window of a high-end florist, the kind of place that made Lila's roses look like weeds. The man bought the bouquet without hesitation, slipping a $50 bill from his wallet. Lila looked down at her own flowers. They were just as beautiful once, before the cold and the hours took their toll. She bit her lip, willing herself not to cry. Lila's life hadn't always been like this. Her memories of a happier time were hazy but comforting. The warmth of her parents' laughter, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the feel of their small but lively home. But those moments had been stolen from her years ago. A car accident claimed both her parents, leaving her in the care of her grandmother, Alma. Alma was a kind but frail woman who had worked tirelessly as a seamstress until arthritis crippled her hands. Now she could barely manage to hold a needle, let alone keep up with their mounting bills. With no steady income and little help from the government, they had been forced to rely on what little they could scrape together. Selling flowers on the street became their last, desperate attempt at survival. The racism and prejudice that Alma faced as an immigrant from the Caribbean weighed heavily on them both. Their landlord often refused to fix broken heaters or leaky pipes, muttering under his breath about people who shouldn't be here. Doctors dismissed Alma's pain, chalking it up to old age rather than taking her concerns seriously. And when Lila started school, the whispers and sidelong glances from her classmates told her she was different in ways they didn't approve of. The weight of those moments followed her to the square, where she had to endure the pitying stares of some and the disgusted scowls of others. But worse than either was the indifference, the countless people who passed her without so much as a glance, as if she were invisible. Lila's small world was a microcosm of a society that had learned to overlook the struggles of people like her. Despite everything, Lila stood her ground in the square. She had learned to force a smile, to greet people with a cheerfulness she didn't always feel. She told herself she was doing this for Alma, who sat at home wrapped in blankets, her health fading but her spirit strong. Alma always said, "We may not have much, but we have each other, and that's more than some people can say." Still, it was hard not to feel the unfairness of it all. Lila's hands were red and raw from the cold, her stomach growling from skipping breakfast again. She watched as shoppers left cafes with steaming cups of coffee and bags of pastries, while she counted every penny to make sure they had enough for a loaf of bread. "Please," she whispered as another woman brushed past her without stopping, "just one rose." Her voice cracked, and she squeezed the handle of her basket tighter. The day was only halfway over, but the weight of it already pressed down on her shoulders. Every unsold flower was another nail in the coffin of their survival. But even as the day stretched on and her hope began to waver, Lila refused to leave. She couldn't. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and despair, a small flicker of determination remained. She wasn't just selling flowers. She was fighting to keep herself and her grandmother afloat. And no matter how heavy the burden, she had no choice but to keep trying. The afternoon sun broke through the gray clouds, painting the bustling square in patches of weak gold. Lila shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to ignore the ache in her legs. Her voice had grown hoarse from calling out to passers-by who never stopped. The crowd thinned for a moment, and she leaned against the lamppost, allowing herself a brief respite. She scanned the square, her eyes lingering on the polished storefronts and the clusters of people laughing as they exited cafes and boutiques. She imagined what it would be like to walk into one of those stores, to not have to count every penny before making a purchase. But her daydreams were interrupted by a low hum, a sleek black car gliding to a stop just a few feet away. The vehicle stood out, even in a city accustomed to luxury. Heads turned as people whispered among themselves. A man stepped out, tall and casual in a leather jacket and sneakers, though his posture carried an air of quiet authority. His name rippled through the murmurs. Elon Musk, someone said in awe. Lila didn't recognize the name. She only noticed the way he moved through the square, his sharp gaze taking in the surroundings as if seeing everything for the first time. She quickly straightened her posture, gripping her basket tighter. If anyone could afford a flower, it was someone who arrived in a car like that. As he approached her, Lila froze. His presence felt different, calm, observant, yet strangely approachable. She didn't know what to expect when he stopped in front of her. "How much for a flower?" he asked, his voice deep but soft. His question took her by surprise. Most people who bothered to stop haggled, sneering as they asked why her flowers were so expensive. But his tone carried no mockery, only curiosity. $5, she managed, her voice small. He glanced at her basket, his eyes lingering on the wilting roses. "How many do you have?" She hesitated, unsure why he was asking. 30, she answered cautiously. He nodded, pulling a crisp $100 bill from his wallet. "I'll take them all," he said, placing the bill in her hand. "Keep the change." Lila stared at the money, disbelief washing over her. "All of them," she repeated, unsure if she'd heard him right. He smiled faintly. "Yes, all of them." "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. But before she could say more, he spoke again. "Do you sell here every day?" he asked, tilting his head slightly as if trying to understand her better. "Yes, sir," she replied, hugging the basket to her chest. "I sell to help my grandma." His expression softened. "What about school?" Lila hesitated. She had learned long ago that the truth often earned her pity, not solutions. But there was something about this man that made her feel she could be honest. "I don't go to school much," she admitted, lowering her gaze. "I have to work." Elon studied her for a moment, his brows furrowing slightly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked briskly back to his car. Lila watched him leave, confusion and a pang of disappointment stirring in her chest. She was used to people leaving, but something about this felt different. She thought the encounter was over, but then he returned carrying a tablet. He crouched down to her level, his presence suddenly less imposing and more like a friend. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila," she said softly. "Lila," he repeated as if committing it to memory. "I want to help you." Her eyes widened, her grip on the basket tightening. "Help me," she echoed, her voice skeptical despite the hope bubbling in her chest. He nodded. "I don't just want to buy flowers. I want to make sure you don't have to sell them anymore." He paused, his gaze steady. "Where's your family?" Her chest tightened. The last thing she wanted was to reveal how dire their situation was to a stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. But something about his earnest expression made her feel safe. Slowly, she explained about her grandmother, their struggles, and the long days spent trying to make ends meet. Elon listened without interrupting, his face a mix of concern and thoughtfulness. "You're incredibly brave," he said when she finished. "I've met a lot of hardworking people, but not many who have to work as hard as you do at your age." His words made her chest ache, but she didn't respond. She didn't know what to say. "I'm starting something new," he continued. "A foundation to help kids like you. Kids who work hard and don't give up. I want to fund your education, get your grandmother the care she needs, and help you build a better future." Her breath caught in her throat. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you deserve it," he said simply. "But I'll need something from you." Her brows furrowed. "What?" He smiled. "I need you to promise me that no matter how hard it gets, you won't give up. Can you do that?" Lila stared at him, her mind reeling. She thought of Alma at home, of their leaking ceiling and empty pantry. She thought of the kids at school who sneered at her, of the landlords who refused to fix their heater. "I promise," she said, her voice steady despite the tears forming in her eyes. Elon extended his hand and she shook it, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, the world didn't feel so cold. The day after her encounter with the stranger in the square, Lila awoke to the familiar chill of their drafty apartment. Sunlight filtered through the tattered curtains, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the small pile of blankets covering her grandmother Alma, who was still asleep. The $100 bill sat folded neatly on the cracked nightstand, untouched. Lila stared at it, the events of the previous day replaying in her mind. She wondered if it had all been a dream. No one had ever stopped to notice her before, let alone offered to help. Later that morning, as Layla prepared to head back to the square, there was a knock at the door. Her heart jumped. Unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. Landlords demanding overdue rent or strangers selling things they couldn't afford. She hesitated before opening the door, and when she did, her breath caught. Standing in the dim hallway were two well-dressed men holding clipboards and wearing warm, polite smiles. "Good morning," one of them said. "Is this the home of Lila and Alma?" Lila's instinct was to shut the door, but something stopped her. "Who are you?" she asked warily. "We're part of a team working with Mr. Elon Musk," the other man said, his voice calm and reassuring. "He asked us to come by to speak with you and your grandmother." Lila blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "You mean the man from yesterday?" "Yes," the first man replied. "He told us about you and your family. May we come in?" Lila hesitated. Alma's warnings about strangers echoed in her mind, but the men seemed kind, and the mention of Elon's name reassured her. Reluctantly, she stepped aside. The men entered and took in their surroundings with polite discretion. Their expressions didn't show pity, only a quiet determination to help. Alma, woken by the sound of voices, sat up slowly, her frail hands gripping the edge of the blanket. "Who are they, Lila?" she asked, her voice weak but steady. "They said they work for the man from yesterday," Lila explained, her voice cautious but tinged with hope. One of the men stepped forward and introduced himself. "Mrs. Alma, we're here to help. Mr. Musk has asked us to support your family with immediate assistance. We'd like to arrange medical care for you and provide a more stable living situation for both of you. And most importantly, we want to make sure Lila has access to education." Alma's eyes filled with tears. "Education," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We've dreamed of it, but there's no money." "There will be now," the man assured her gently. "Mr. Musk has set aside funds to cover everything: school fees, supplies, and even transportation. We've already identified a nearby school with excellent resources. Lila could start as soon as you're ready." Lila's heart raced. She looked at Alma, whose lined face was overcome with emotion. They had struggled for so long that the idea of help, real, tangible help, felt almost impossible to believe. The men stayed for over an hour, asking questions and taking notes about their needs. They promised to arrange a doctor's visit for Alma that week and explained that a moving company would help relocate them to a safer apartment. They even brought a small envelope of cash to cover groceries and essentials until the larger plans were in motion. Lila listened to every word, her emotions shifting between gratitude, disbelief, and a cautious optimism. But one question lingered in her mind. "Why is he doing this?" she asked finally, unable to hold back her curiosity. The men exchanged a glance, smiling slightly. "Because he believes in people who work hard," one of them said. "Mr. Musk sees potential in you, Lila. He said you reminded him of himself when he was young, determined, resourceful, and unwilling to give up no matter how tough things got." The words warmed Lila's chest. No one had ever described her like that before. Most people dismissed her as a poor girl on the street, someone to be pitied or ignored. But Elon Musk had seen something different. After the men left, Lila and Alma sat in silence for a long time, absorbing the enormity of what had just happened. Finally, Alma reached for Lila's hand, her eyes shimmering with tears. "This is a blessing," Alma said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've worked so hard, my sweet girl. Maybe this is your chance to have the life you deserve." Lila nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. But deep down, she knew that this opportunity wasn't just for her. It was for Alma, who had sacrificed so much to raise her. It was for every time they had been overlooked or dismissed because of their skin or their poverty. She thought of Elon Musk's words, "Don't give up." It was more than a promise now. It was a responsibility. For the first time in her life, she felt like someone believed in her. She wouldn't let them down. The new apartment wasn't anything grand. It was a small two-bedroom unit in a modest building on the outskirts of the city. But to Lila and Alma, it felt like a palace. The walls were freshly painted, the heaters worked, and there were no leaks in the ceiling. Best of all, the kitchen was stocked with groceries when they arrived. For the first time in years, Lila didn't have to wonder where her next meal would come from. "This doesn't feel real," Alma whispered as she sat at the small dining table, her gnarled hands resting on its smooth surface. She looked around, her face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "It's like we've stepped into someone else's life." Lila smiled as she unpacked the last of their few belongings. "It's ours now, Grandma. They said this place is just the start." True to their word, Elon's team had acted swiftly. Within days, a doctor visited Alma to assess her health. For the first time, Alma felt like more than just a statistic or a burden. The doctor patiently listened to her concerns, prescribed medication for her arthritis, and recommended a physical therapist to help her regain mobility. Lila watched the care and attention Alma received with a mixture of relief and anger. Relief because her grandmother was finally getting the help she deserved. Anger because it had taken so long. How many others like Alma were suffering in silence, ignored by a system that should have protected them? On Lila's first day at school, her nerves nearly got the better of her. The school was unlike any she had attended before. A large, clean building with rows of neatly maintained lockers and a library that smelled of books and possibility. The other students arrived in crisp uniforms, their backpacks filled with expensive gadgets. Lila's secondhand clothes, though clean and mended, felt out of place. She clenched her fists as she walked through the crowded hallways, the whispers and glances of her classmates following her. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their curiosity about the new girl who didn't look or sound like them. Her face burned with shame and anger. But as she entered her classroom, she remembered Elon's words. "Don't give up." The teacher greeted her warmly and introduced her to the class. Though she remained quiet for most of the day, Lila couldn't help but marvel at the resources around her. Modern desks, textbooks for every subject, even computers that the students used during lessons. She promised herself she would make the most of this opportunity, no matter how hard it felt. That evening, Lila shared every detail of her day with Alma, who listened intently from her seat in the living room. Her grandmother's eyes lit up when Lila described the science lab, the library, and the way the teacher had praised her math skills. "You're going to do great things," Alma said, her voice filled with pride. "I've always known it." But despite Alma's encouragement, Lila couldn't ignore the lingering feeling that she didn't belong. The other students hadn't been outright mean, but their stares and whispers told her she was different. She overheard one boy mutter something about the scholarship kid, and it stung. That night, as she lay in bed, Lila thought about the road ahead. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Prejudice had followed her from the streets to the classroom, and she realized that no amount of money or opportunity could erase it entirely. But she also knew she couldn't let it stop her. She thought of Alma, finally sleeping peacefully in the next room. She thought of Elon Musk, a stranger who had looked at her and seen something worth investing in. Most of all, she thought of the little girl who had once stood in the cold selling flowers to survive. As the days turned into weeks, Lila began to find her footing. She poured herself into her studies, spending hours in the library reading about science, technology, and the world beyond the city. Her teachers noticed her determination and encouraged her to join extracurricular activities, where she started to find her voice. But the whispers didn't stop. Some students questioned her intelligence, assuming she was only at the school because of charity. Others looked down on her for her background, their subtle comments cutting deeper than they realized. One day, after overhearing a particularly cruel remark, Lila confronted her grandmother. "Why do they hate me, Grandma?" she asked, her voice trembling with frustration. "I'm just like them, but they treat me like I don't belong." Alma pulled Lila into a hug, her frail arms still strong enough to hold the weight of her granddaughter's pain. "They don't hate you, child. They fear what they don't understand. You're strong, and you're different, and that frightens people who've never had to struggle." Her grandmother's words gave her strength, but they didn't erase the sting of rejection. Still, Lila resolved to prove them wrong, not just for herself, but for Alma, for the kids like her who might never get a second chance, and for the man who had believed in her when no one else did. For the first time in her life, Lila had hope, and she wouldn't let it slip away. Lila's days began to follow a new rhythm. Mornings were filled with classes, afternoons with homework and club meetings, and evenings spent with Alma, who grew stronger with the help of her new medical regimen. Slowly but surely, their lives settled into a kind of stability Lila had never known. But no matter how much progress she made, the weight of prejudice followed her like a shadow. It happened in subtle ways. In group projects, her classmates rarely listened to her ideas. In the robotics club, she often caught the other students exchanging skeptical glances when she spoke up. A few even went so far as to question how she had gotten into the school. "Probably some diversity scholarship," a boy muttered one afternoon, loud enough for her to hear. The words hit her like a slap, but she bit her tongue, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. That evening, as she sat at the kitchen table working on her science homework, Alma noticed her furrowed brow. "What's troubling you, child?" she asked gently. Lila hesitated. "They don't think I belong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "No matter how hard I try, it's like they see me as less." Alma reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over Lila's. "You've got a fire in you, my girl," she said firmly. "Don't let their ignorance dim it. Show them who you are by what you do, not by what they say." Her grandmother's words bolstered her spirit, but Lila knew she had to do more than just endure. She had to excel. Fueled by determination, Lila threw herself into her work. In class, she raised her hand to answer questions, refusing to let fear of judgment hold her back. In the robotics club, she stayed late after meetings, tinkering with prototypes until her fingers ached. Slowly, her efforts began to pay off. Her teachers praised her innovative ideas, and her robotics projects started gaining attention. During a regional science competition, Lila presented a design for a low-cost solar-powered water purifier, inspired by the struggles she had seen in her old neighborhood. The judges were so impressed that she won first place, earning a trophy and a scholarship for college. The recognition felt like validation, but it also came with new challenges. Her victory drew admiration from some classmates, but others saw it as proof that she didn't deserve her success. "She only won because of her story," one girl whispered in the hallway. They felt sorry for her. Lila heard the comment and clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. But instead of lashing out, she reminded herself of Alma's advice. "Show them who you are by what you do." The turning point came during the school's annual robotics showcase, where each student was tasked with presenting a project that demonstrated innovation and practicality. Lila spent months perfecting her design, a lightweight modular solar panel system that could be easily installed in underserved communities. On the day of the showcase, the gymnasium buzzed with excitement as students set up their displays. Lila worked quietly, her hands steady but her heart pounding. She knew that this was more than just a project. It was her chance to prove that she belonged. When it was her turn to present, she stepped onto the stage and faced the crowd, her palms damp with nerves. But as she began to speak, her confidence grew. She explained the science behind her design, the real-world problems it aimed to solve, and the potential it had to change lives. By the time she finished, the audience was silent, hanging on her every word. Then came the applause, loud, thunderous, and genuine. For the first time, Lila felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Later that evening, as she packed up her materials, her robotics teacher approached her with a wide smile. "Lila, that was incredible," he said. "You're going to go far. I hope you know that." Her heart swelled with pride, but she thought of Alma's words and Elon Musk's promise. "I'm just getting started," she replied. Despite the accolades, Lila remained grounded. She knew that her success wasn't just for her. It was for Alma, who had sacrificed so much to give her a chance. It was for the countless kids like her who were overlooked and underestimated. And it was for the little girl who had once sold flowers on the street, dreaming of a life beyond survival. But more than anything, it was a promise to herself, to rise above, no matter how high the odds were stacked against her. By the time Lila turned 25, Her name had become synonymous with innovation and change. Her startup, Bright Horizon Technologies, was making headlines for its mission to bring affordable, renewable energy solutions to underserved communities around the world. She had taken the lessons from her childhood, resilience, resourcefulness, and a determination to overcome obstacles, and poured them into her work. But success didn't shield her from the challenges she faced as a woman of color in the tech industry. Boardroom meetings were often dominated by older men who questioned her authority. Investors grilled her more harshly than her male counterparts. At conferences, she was often mistaken for an assistant rather than the CEO. The most painful moments came when she encountered outright racism. At a networking event in Silicon Valley, a prominent venture capitalist casually remarked, "It's inspiring to see someone like you doing so well. It must have been hard given where you came from." Lila forced a tight smile, her fists clenched beneath the table. "Yes," she replied coolly, "but where I come from isn't what defines me. It's where I'm going." Later, she replayed the conversation in her mind, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. But instead of letting it consume her, she channeled it into her work. Every slight, every dismissal became fuel for her drive to succeed, not just for herself, but for the people who believed in her. Lila's breakthrough moment came when Bright Horizon unveiled its latest product, the Solar Bloom, a compact and modular solar panel system designed to be easily installed in rural areas with limited resources. The design, reminiscent of the prototype she had created in high school, was a game changer for communities that had long been left behind by technological advancements. The launch event was held in a sprawling conference hall filled with journalists, investors, and industry leaders. Lila stood at the podium, her voice steady and confident as she explained the impact of the Solar Bloom. "This isn't just a product," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "It's a bridge to a future where everyone, regardless of where they're born or what they look like, has access to the energy they need to thrive." The room erupted into applause, and for a moment, Lila allowed herself to bask in the recognition. But her mind was already on the next step, scaling production, securing partnerships, and ensuring that the Solar Bloom reached the people who needed it most. Among the audience that day was Elon Musk. He hadn't seen Lila in years, but had followed her journey with quiet pride. After the event, he approached her, his expression warm. "Lila," he said, extending his hand, "you've outdone yourself." She shook his hand, her smile genuine. "Thank you. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Elon waved off the comment. "You did the hard part. I just gave you a little push." They spoke for a while, reminiscing about the day they met in the square. Elon was struck by how much she had grown, not just in skill and success, but in the way she carried herself. She exuded confidence and determination, a living testament to the power of opportunity and resilience. As the evening wore on, Lila found herself alone on the balcony of the conference hall, looking out over the city lights. She thought about her journey, from selling flowers on the street to standing on a stage in front of the world's most influential people. She thought of Alma, whose unwavering belief in her had been the foundation of everything she achieved. But most of all, she thought of the countless kids who were still standing in the cold, their potential ignored by a world too busy to notice. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself. The world might have underestimated her, but she had proven that barriers could be broken, and she wasn't finished yet. Lila sat in a small, brightly lit classroom in a rural village, far from the bustling city where her journey had begun. Outside the window, the sun blazed, its rays bouncing off a row of Solar Bloom panels installed on the roofs of nearby homes. Children laughed as they ran through the dusty streets, their shouts mingling with the distant hum of a generator that no longer relied on expensive, polluting fuel. She had come here to meet the people whose lives had been transformed by Bright Horizons' work. As a young girl approached her, holding a notebook filled with carefully written English sentences, Lila felt a pang of recognition. The girl's wide eyes and determined expression reminded her of herself. The child who had once stood on a cold street corner selling flowers, her voice lost in the crowd. "Miss Lila," the girl said shyly, "thank you for the lights. Now I can study at night." Lila knelt to meet her gaze, her heart swelling. "You're welcome," she said gently, "but the real thanks go to you for working so hard. Keep it up, okay? The girl nodded eagerly before running off to join her friends. Lila watched her go, a lump forming in her throat. Moments like these were what made every struggle, every late night, and every painful encounter worth it. Back at the village meeting hall, Lila joined a group of community leaders who wanted to expand the Solar Bloom project to nearby towns. They spoke with gratitude and hope, their excitement palpable as they outlined plans for schools, clinics, and businesses that could thrive with reliable energy. When the meeting ended, Lila stood at the entrance, taking in the sight of a community that was finally coming alive. Her thoughts drifted to Alma, who had passed away the previous year. Lila carried her grandmother's memory with her everywhere, often imagining what Alma would say if she could see all that had been accomplished. "I hope I've made you proud," Lila whispered to the sky. The story of Lila's journey had become a beacon of hope for others. Media outlets hailed her as a trailblazer, and her name appeared on lists of the most influential people in the world. But Lila remained humble, her focus always on the mission rather than the accolades. At an international conference on innovation and equity, she was invited to deliver a keynote address. As she stood on stage, her speech prepared but her heart full of raw emotion, she looked out at the thousands of faces before her, scientists, entrepreneurs, and policymakers who had come to hear her speak. "When I was a child," she began, her voice steady, "I stood on a street corner selling flowers, wondering if anyone saw me. I thought my worth was measured by the dollars I made each day. But one person did see me. He saw my potential, even when I couldn't. What I've learned since then is that potential exists everywhere. It's in the child studying by candlelight, in the grandmother fighting for her family, in the worker who dreams of a better life. The question isn't whether potential exists, it's whether we choose to nurture it. We live in a world where too many are ignored, dismissed, or underestimated because of their circumstances, their race, or their gender. But if we invest in people, not just their work, but their dreams, we can create a future where everyone has the chance to rise." Her words echoed in the vast hall, met with a standing ovation that lasted long after she stepped off the stage. Later that evening, as she stood by herself, reflecting on the moment, Elon Musk approached her. His face carried the same calm, thoughtful expression he'd worn the day they met. "You've done something extraordinary," he said. "So have you," she replied, smiling. "You gave me a chance." Elon shook his head. "No, you took the chance and turned it into something much bigger than I ever imagined." They talked for a while, reminiscing about the street corner where their paths first crossed. Before he left, Elon said, "You're changing the world, Lila. Never stop." Lila never did. She continued to build, to innovate, and to fight for a world where no child had to feel invisible. Her work touched millions, her name inspiring hope in places where hope was scarce. But she never forgot her roots, the little girl with the basket of flowers, the sick grandmother who believed in her, and the stranger who saw her worth. She had become more than just a success story. She had become a symbol of what could happen when society chose to see, to care, and to act. And though her journey had transformed her life, her ultimate goal was always the same: to ensure no one else's light was ever left unseen. For Lila, life was no longer about survival. It was about creating a world where everyone had the chance to thrive. Thank you so much for watching this story. Your support means everything to us. If you enjoyed it and want to see more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear from you. What time are you watching this video, and where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below and let us know. It's always amazing to see how far our community reaches. And remember, every share, like, or comment helps us spread these powerful stories to more people. Thanks for being part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next one.